A Christmas song had signaled the final hour of Saigon. Not an air raid siren, not the declaration of a president, not the sound of tanks at the gateway to the capital. On the morning of April 29th, 1975, amid the stifling heat of Saigon, the melody of White Christmas rang out like a code. For those who understood that signal, it meant leave immediately. Operation Frequent Wind, the United States' final helicopter evacuation from Saigon, had begun. But history did not open its doors to everyone. Some had their names on the list. Some had papers. Some were called onto the helicopters. Some stood outside the gate, holding their children in their arms, looking up at the sky and understanding that they did not belong on that final flight. In the hour when a regime collapsed, the most painful question was not only who won and who lost. The most painful question was, who would be saved, who would be left behind, and who would have to go on living with the part of history that others had decided for them. Later, one photograph became the symbol of that final hour, evacuees climbing a ladder to board an Air America helicopter on the roof of a building. For many years, many people believed it was the roof of the United States Embassy. But it was not. It was the rooftop of number 22 Gia Long Street. A small detail, yet it reminds us that historical memory can sometimes be true in emotion while still being wrong in place. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell. For Hanoi, it was the victorious conclusion of a long war and the path toward national reunification. For the Republic of Vietnam, it was the disappearance of a state, an army, a flag, and a way of life. For the United States, it was the image of withdrawal after many years of bloodshed, commitment, and doubt. But for ordinary Vietnamese families, the most painful question was not only who won and who lost. It was who would be sent to re-education camps, who would have to flee by sea, who would remain in silence, and who would spend the rest of their life calling their homeland by a very distant word, memory. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Agreement was signed. On paper, it was an accord intended to end the war and restore peace in Vietnam. For the United States, it opened the path for prisoners of war to return home and for American forces to withdraw from a war that had divided American society itself. For Hanoi, it was a major diplomatic victory, forcing the United States military to leave the battlefield. For Saigon, however, that document carried a feeling difficult to name. It resembled peace, but it was not entirely peace. It resembled a guarantee, but behind that guarantee was the fear that from then on, South Vietnam would have to stand alone before the storm that was coming. Just over 2 months later, on March 29, 1973, the withdrawal of American forces under the Paris Agreement was completed. The last United States combat units left South Vietnam. An era closed with the sound of aircraft, the sound of soldiers' boots leaving their bases, and news reports speaking of peace with honor. But on the ground, the guns did not truly fall silent. The two Vietnamese sides continued to seize land, hold land, and test each other in disputed areas. Supply routes continued to expand. Weapons depots continued to be replenished. Units at the front still lived with the very clear sense that the war had only changed its form, not disappeared. The bitterness lay in this. The Paris Agreement did not create a peace strong enough to protect those living inside it. South Vietnam at that time still had a government, an army, a capital, schools, markets, churches, pagodas, movie theaters, cafes, and families trying to preserve a normal life. But beneath that rhythm of life, the foundation had already begun to crack. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was still large and still fighting, but after the Americans withdrew, every burden became heavier. Ammunition, fuel, airlift, logistics, confidence, and even the silent question inside the heart of each soldier. If the worst situation came, who would return to save us? In Washington, the promise to Saigon also gradually lost its weight. After many years of war, American society was exhausted. Congress no longer wanted to give the president additional authority to intervene militarily again in Indochina. The Watergate scandal weakened the Nixon administration day by day, and then, on August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned. The man whose name had been tied to the promise of peace with honor left the White House, leaving behind a South Vietnamese ally that needed assurance more than ever. From that moment on, Saigon still received words of reassurance, but reassurance could not replace bombs, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, or the political will of a superpower that already wanted to turn away. For Hanoi, that void was an opportunity. Even without viewing the war as a simple chessboard, one could see that the balance was shifting. When the United States military was no longer directly engaged in combat, when the possibility of renewed bombing was constrained by American politics, when aid to South Vietnam was reduced and morale in Saigon was worn down, the question was no longer whether the war would continue. The question became, when would be the right moment to launch the decisive blow? Therefore, the period after the Paris Agreement should not be seen as a pause between two storms. It was the quietest part of the storm itself. In diplomatic documents, people saw the word peace. But in the barracks of the South, in meetings in Hanoi, and in reports sent back to Washington, everyone understood that this peace was not strong enough to hold back a country slowly sliding toward its fate. Perhaps Saigon did not collapse only on April 30th, 1975. Part of that collapse had already begun from the day the signatures in Paris dried, while the guns and ammunition still remained on the battlefield. And as the protective umbrella of the United States gradually closed, the Republic of Vietnam entered its final 2 years with a question that became increasingly difficult to avoid. If tomorrow there was no longer anyone standing behind it, would the South have enough strength to stand on its own? After the Paris Agreement, the Republic of Vietnam did not disappear immediately. Saigon still kept its lights on. Schools still opened their doors. Markets were still crowded. Cafes still had music. Movie theaters still had audiences. And families still tried to keep the evening meal looking like any other day. Seen from the outside, the South was still a living nation. But history has very quiet moments. The surface remains intact, while underneath, cracks have already begun to run deep into the foundation. Within the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, that anxiety first appeared through very concrete things: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medicine, flight hours, and the capacity for logistics. An army may have large numbers, generals, combat-ready units, and soldiers who still want to fight. But if fuel gradually runs low, artillery must save every shell, aircraft reduce their operating hours, wounded soldiers lack medicine, then strength no longer lies in uniforms or ranks. It lies in logistics depots, in supply routes, and in the belief that tomorrow there will still be enough means to hold on. That is the tragedy rarely seen in footage of Saigon's final day. People often remember helicopters, tanks, and the gates of Independence Palace. But before a capital collapses, many things have already been running out, things that cameras cannot easily record. A pilot can no longer fly enough hours. A unit can no longer maneuver as before. A commander must choose which place to hold and which place to abandon, not only by looking at a map, but by counting the ammunition that remains, the vehicles still able to run, and the soldiers who still believe in orders. In United States documents from 1974, this anxiety was recorded very clearly. The Ford administration once assessed that the level of $700 million in military aid for fiscal year 1975 would seriously reduce the combat effectiveness of South Vietnamese forces. The numbers in the report were not cold statistics. They were signs of a body losing blood. The Army's capacity being pulled far below the previous year's level, the Air Force forced to reduce operations, ships and boats restricted, medicine and fuel facing the danger of depletion. For a nation living in war, that was not only a shortage of money, it was a shortage of time. From Saigon's side, the feeling of being abandoned did not exist only in high-level meetings. It seeped down into each barracks, each soldier's family, each neighborhood hearing that the war was drawing closer day by day. The South Vietnamese soldier did not always flee, as later simplistic accounts would sometimes suggest. There were units that fought to the end. There were men who held their positions in despair. There were officers who understood that they were facing a war in which the material, political, and diplomatic conditions were no longer what they had once been. In the military memoir, The Final Collapse, General Cao Van Vien, The last chief of the Joint General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Vietnam viewed this period from inside a system, trying to keep its balance as its pillars weakened one after another. But it must also be said plainly, the South was not weak only because of external forces. Within that political order, there were wounds that had lasted for many years: corruption, political division, heavy dependence on aid, the distance between cities and the countryside, between those who had the means to leave and those who had no choice. A nation can be supplied with weapons, but no one can forever supply it with a shared belief. When the people begin to doubt the future, when soldiers begin to ask themselves what will happen to their families if the defensive line breaks, when the leadership can no longer create a sense of control, then collapse does not come only from the enemy. It grows from the insecurity within. Therefore, the final 2 years of the Republic of Vietnam should not be told as the story of a government simply erased from the map. It is the story of a real nation, with real people, real mistakes, real hopes, and very real fears. It was not perfect. It was not innocent of its own failures, but it also cannot be reduced to a cold footnote in history. Behind the name Saigon were millions of lives trying to guess where they would still belong tomorrow. When the protective umbrella closed, the South did not immediately break apart. It stood for a while longer in a great wind. But by the beginning of 1975, that wind was no longer only blowing around Saigon. It began to gather over the Central Highlands, where the first fall would turn silent anxiety into a chain collapse. In early March 1975, the war no longer advanced toward Saigon along a straight line that was easy to see. It began in the Central Highlands, where mountains, highlands, narrow roads, and towns that seemed far from the capital held a life-or-death position on the map of the South. In the eyes of many people, Buon Ma Thuột at that time was still a highland city of coffee, red earth, barracks, markets, and families trying to live through each uncertain day. But in strategic calculations, it was a link in a chain. When that link was struck, the whole chain could tremble from Pleiku, Kon Tum, Nha Trang, Da Nang, and finally Saigon. In the early morning of March 10, 1975, Northern forces launched an attack on Buon Ma Thuột. That strike was not aimed merely at capturing a place name. It struck at the judgment of the South's command, because in the preceding period, many diversionary signs had led the Republic of Vietnam to remain concerned that the main target might be Pleiku or Kon Tum. When Buon Ma Thuột was hit hard and fast, surprise became a weapon. By March 11, 1975, Buon Ma Thuột had essentially fallen into the hands of the attacking forces, although several remaining points of resistance continued until March 17th. From that moment, the Central Highlands were no longer a separate battlefield. They became the opening point of a chain collapse. For Hanoi, Buon Ma Thuột was a strategic blow delivered precisely against a weak point. It proved that the South no longer had enough strength to hold every territory as before, and that if the pace were accelerated, the opportunity could grow faster than any prediction. For Saigon, that blow raised a painful question. Should it hold the Central Highlands at all costs, or withdraw forces to defend the more populous and coastal regions? There was no easy choice. To stay might mean being cut off and destroyed. To withdraw risked turning a military decision into a civilian panic. On March 14, 1975, President Nguyen Van Thieu met with several generals at Cam Ranh and decided to withdraw from the Central Highlands, hoping to gather forces back toward the coastal region. On the map, it may have looked like a redeployment. But in real life, a map cannot carry the elderly, children, wounded soldiers, soldiers' families, vehicles, stores, fear, and rumors passed from one mouth to another. The withdrawal plan was kept secret, but that very secrecy left many levels of command, local units, and civilians without time to prepare. When orders began turning into movement, order was quickly tested by crowds, bad roads, lack of information, and the pressure of pursuit. The retreat along Route 7B became one of the most painful images of that spring. It was no longer an army moving neatly in formation. It was an enormous human stream, with soldiers, civilians, military vehicles, civilian vehicles, carts carrying belongings, people holding children, people pulling one another through red dust and panic. Some did not fully understand why they had to leave. Some thought they would leave home for only a few days and then return. Some families carried with them very small things: a bag of clothes, papers, a little money, a photograph, a child asleep on the mother's shoulder. In war, sometimes what hurts people most is not the sound of gunfire, but the moment when they must leave home without knowing whether it is the last time. On March 17, 1975, the situation became even more serious. The attacking side captured the remaining positions in Buon Ma Thuot, while Kon Tum and Pleiku, in turn, slipped from the hands of the Saigon government. What unfolded afterward showed that collapse did not lie only in the loss of territory. It lay in the feeling of losing control. When a unit no longer has clear contact with higher command, when civilians pour into withdrawal routes, when bad news travels faster than orders, an entire system can break apart before the final battle truly takes place. A United States intelligence report in late March 1975 assessed that the military situation of the Saigon government in Region 2 had deteriorated very rapidly. Many highland provinces had been abandoned, units withdrawing from Kon Tum and Pleiku had fallen into disorder, and large amounts of ammunition, fuel, and equipment had been left behind along the road. The Central Highlands, therefore, were not only a military defeat. They were the moment when the South's quiet anxiety turned into images that anyone could see. Abandoned supply depots, crowds trapped on the roads, shattered units, voices calling to one another through the red dust of the highlands, all of it signaled that the war had entered a different rhythm. No longer was it the rhythm of years, dry seasons, and negotiations. From this point on, time was compressed. A single day could change the fate of an entire region. An unprepared decision could open the way for a series of other desperate decisions. After the fall in the Central Highlands, Saigon did not collapse immediately. But from the capital, people had already begun to hear the sound of cracking echoing back from the highland roads. And as distant regions fell one after another, the question was no longer whether the war would reach Saigon, but how much time that city still had before facing the unavoidable. After the Central Highlands, the collapse was no longer something taking place in remote areas on the map. It began entering each home in Saigon through short news bulletins, rumors, vehicles carrying relatives from the central region into the city, and exhausted faces standing before the doors of family members without knowing what to say first. The city still had restaurants, traffic, and street cries, but in every conversation, people could hear something no one yet wanted to name. If Hue, Da Nang, and the Central Highlands had fallen one after another, how much longer could Saigon last? On April 21st, 1975, in the reception hall of Independence Palace, President Nguyen Van Thieu delivered his resignation speech and transferred power to Vice President Tran Van Huong, according to the Constitution of the Republic of Vietnam. It was not merely a change of personnel at the top. It was the moment when a regime was trying to recover its final breath through a political movement that came too late. The man who had led the South through the fiercest years of the war left his position when defensive lines had already broken, when faith in external aid had worn thin, and when the capital had begun to feel the pressure of a tightening encirclement. Tran Van Huong took over in a situation that left almost no room for action. He was an elderly civilian politician, someone who had passed many times through the upheavals of Saigon politics, but the final days of April were unlike any previous crisis. Those who still hoped for a negotiated solution understood that time was running out very quickly. Those who wanted to leave understood that each additional day of delay meant the list grew shorter. Those who chose to stay asked themselves how to prepare their spirit for a morning when the flag over the city might be different. By the afternoon of April 28, 1975, at Independence Palace, the handover ceremony took place between President Tran Van Huong and the new president Dung Van Minh. That moment carried a strangely solemn air because the rituals remained, while real power had almost slipped from the hands of the Saigon government. Dung Van Minh stepped into the presidency with the fragile hope that his name and old connections might open a path to negotiation, or at least spare Saigon from a bloody battle inside the city. But history sometimes does not give people enough time to do what they wish to do. There are seats of power that remain only as places where one sits down to sign and acknowledge the end. Also, on that same April 28th, Tan Son Nhut Air Base was bombed by a 37 aircraft captured from the Republic of Vietnam Air Force and used by the Quy Tăng Squadron. For the people of Saigon, that sound was a very clear warning that the war had reached the final gateway. Tan Son Nhut was not only an airport, it was the city's way in and out, the place that connected Saigon to the outside world, the last point of hope for evacuation by air. When that place shook, many people understood that the distance between still in time and too late was narrowing by the hour. In those days, Saigon became a city of decisions no one wanted to make. Some burned papers for fear of being identified. Some hid the uniforms of their husbands, fathers, or brothers. Some ran to find their names on evacuation lists. Some went to church. Some went to pagodas, praying for one very small thing, that their family could still remain together through the night. Those who had worked for the old government worried about their fate. The poor, who had nowhere to go, watched the hurried stream of people and understood that in every collapse, those with the fewest choices are often the ones who suffer the most. Dung Van Minh is often remembered as the man who announced the surrender. But before entering that final sentence, he stood in the middle of a city that had almost no way out. If he continued to resist, Saigon could become an urban battlefield, with civilian blood spilled across its streets. If he accepted a handover, many would see him as the man who placed the final period at the end of the Republic of Vietnam. History is sometimes cruel, not because it gives people no choice, but because every choice carries a wound. On the final night before everything changed its name, Saigon did not sleep like an ordinary capital. The city waited amid the sound of engines, distant artillery, people calling to one another, hurried footsteps, and very deep silences behind closed doors. From outside, advancing forces were drawing near. From inside, a government was dissolving into its final hour. And between those two movements were millions of people who only hoped to wake up the next morning still alive. When Saigon had reached the threshold of its fate, the question was no longer whether the city could be held. The remaining question was which forces would enter, at what speed, and whether the final victory could end the war without turning the capital into a sea of fire. As Saigon approached its final days, on the other side of the front line, every movement was no longer a tentative step. After the Central Highlands, Hue, Da Nang, and a series of defensive lines collapsed, the Politburo in Hanoi understood that the opportunity no longer lay in the distant future. It was opening right before their eyes, very quickly, very urgently, and if delayed, the war could continue with unnecessary losses. On April 7, 1975, General Vuong Nguyen Giap sent his famous order: speed, still greater speed, boldness, still greater boldness, seize every hour, every minute, rush to the front, liberate the South. On April 14, 1975, the campaign to liberate Saigon Gia Dinh was officially named the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. That name was not merely a military designation. For the soldiers from the North, who had passed through many years of bombs and bullets, and for the revolutionary forces that had held on in the South, it was a spiritual summons. They did not see Saigon only as a target on the map. They saw it as the final door of a war that had lasted too long, where the blood of many generations, the memories of many families, and the aspiration for reunification all converged in one decisive battle. At exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon on April 26, 1975, the Ho Chi Minh Campaign began. From 5 main directions, the Main Force Corps simultaneously advanced into the Saigon Gia Dinh defensive area, forming a large offensive ring intended to paralyze the entire final capacity of the Saigon government to resist. Columns of tanks, artillery, infantry, engineers, signal units, and logistics forces moved one after another toward the city. On the map, they were arrows. In real life, they were people who had passed through many seasons of war, carrying in their backpacks exhaustion, hope, and the belief that this time might be the last. The strength of the campaign did not lie only in numbers or weapons. It lay in speed. After many years of attritional war, the spring of 1975 created a completely different rhythm, faster than any prediction, stronger than the opponent's ability to respond, and so relentless that political decisions in Saigon no longer had time to become a solid defensive posture. When an army advances quickly, the frightening thing is not only that it captures more territory. More frightening is that it leaves the opposing side without enough time to understand what it is losing, without enough calm to choose how to preserve what might still be preserved. From April 26th to April 29th, the attacking columns gradually broke through the outer defensive lines and pressed close to the key gateways of Saigon. In many places, the fighting was fierce. There were soldiers on the Republic of Vietnam side who still resisted in despair. There were units of the Liberation Army that had to cross through firepower, bridges, roads, obstacles, and the last points of resistance in order to enter the city. If one looks only at the final result, it is easy to imagine that everything simply collapsed on its own. But every victory has its price. Even in a campaign described as lightning fast, every bridge, every intersection, every gateway into the capital could become a matter of life and death for young soldiers. What made the Ho Chi Minh campaign the final blow was not only its ability to strike Saigon, it was also its ability to prevent the opposing apparatus from recovering in time. A government may lose a province and reorganize. It may lose a military region and establish a new defensive line. But when the political center, military center, communications, airport, joint general staff, and key gateways are all compressed at the same time, collapse no longer unfolds in fragments. It becomes a system-wide moment. Military victory then meets political disintegration, social exhaustion, diplomatic isolation, and a moment when the opposing side no longer has enough strength to prolong the war. For the victorious side, those final days of April carried the meaning of a historical return. Many soldiers entered Saigon with very real joy, because they believed the war was about to end, the country was about to be joined as one, and the years away from home would no longer stretch on endlessly. But beside that joy, the city before them was not an empty space. Saigon was home to millions of people waiting in fear, to families of the defeated side, to people who did not know whether tomorrow they would be called citizens, enemies, or those who had to learn silence in order to go on living. For that reason, the Ho Chi Minh campaign was the decisive victory on the battlefield, but it also opened a larger question for history. When a war ends with lightning speed, can the human heart keep pace with that speed? And as the attacking columns drew close to the center of Saigon, another retreat was also taking place in desperation. The retreat of those who knew they no longer had much time to leave the city. When the attacking columns had closed in on Saigon, another movement unfolded inside the city, the withdrawal of the Americans and the Vietnamese connected to them. For many weeks before that, evacuations had begun by transport aircraft at Tan Son Nhut. But by April 29, 1975, when the airport was shelled and the runway was no longer safe for large flights, the final route left was by helicopter. Operation Frequent Wind entered its decisive hour. At the assembly points, people did not carry only luggage. They carried files, certificates, letters of recommendation, family photographs, and a few small objects that might prove they had once served, once cooperated, once been promised a way out. Some were employees of American agencies. Some were interpreters, secretaries, drivers, officers, civil servants, journalists, or relatives of families whose names had been called. They understood that in that hour, a piece of paper could weigh more than gold, because it could decide whether a human life would rise onto a helicopter or remain on the ground. Outside the grounds of the United States Embassy, the crowd grew larger by the hour. Many people did not know clearly whether they had any chance, but they still came, because staying at home was more frightening than standing before a gate that might never open. Some held children in their arms. Some pushed through the fence. Some raised their papers high, as if as long as someone saw their name, their fate would change. The guards on the wall were not facing merely a crowd. They were facing the desperation of people who knew that behind them was a regime coming to an end, and before them was a narrow door closing minute by minute. On the East Sea, off the coast of Vung Tau, United States warships waited to receive evacuees. Helicopters flew out continuously, landed, unloaded people onto the decks, and then returned to the city. At times, there were so many helicopters that the decks had no empty space left, and people had to push helicopters into the sea to make room for other flights. It was an almost absurd image, machines that had once symbolized military power being shoved off the deck and sinking into the water, only to make space for human beings. In that moment, the value of war was reversed. Metal could be thrown away. A human life, if it could still be saved, had to be saved immediately. But not everyone was saved. Operation Frequent Wind may be recorded in United States military history as the largest helicopter evacuation, but in the memory of many Vietnamese people, it was also a painful moment of selection. Those whose names were on the list were taken away. Those whose names were not remained behind. Some were lifted from rooftops, airports, diplomatic compounds, hotels, and apartments. Others could only look up at the sky, hear the sound of rotor blades fading into the distance, and understand that from then on, they would have to face their fate by themselves. In the early morning of April 30th, 1975, Ambassador Graham Martin left Saigon by helicopter. The last United States Marines also left the grounds of the embassy afterward. For Washington, the mission to evacuate Americans had been completed. For those still left on the ground, the word completed sounded very different. Because an operation can end on paper when the final helicopter takes off, but in the hearts of those left behind, it only begins a chain of days filled with uncertainty. This was the moral wound of the final hour. A great power could measure the success of the evacuation by the number of people it had taken out of the city, by the number of flights, by the number of casualties avoided. But the families standing outside the fence measured it by the faces that were never called, the promises that could not be kept in time, the fathers, mothers, and children who had to remain behind without knowing how they would be seen the next morning. In that chaos, Saigon did not witness only a military withdrawal. It witnessed a separation between those who had a path of escape and those whom history left behind. When the final helicopter left the sky over Saigon, the city entered its fateful morning. On the ground, the old power would exist for only a few more short hours. And at the center of the city, Independence Palace was waiting for a moment that would turn April 30th into two different memories within the same people. On the morning of April 30th, 1975, Saigon entered the final hours of a political order that had existed for nearly 20 years. Out on the streets, many people no longer knew which direction to look. Some closed their doors and stayed inside, listening to every sound near and far. Some went into the streets with faces gone silent, as if wanting to see with their own eyes the moment when history passed across their lives. The city at that time did not contain only armies, tanks, and orders. It also contained unfinished meals, mothers holding children, soldiers removing their insignia, and families trying to hide their fear in silence while waiting to see how fate would call their names. At around 10:45 in the morning, the attacking forces entered Independence Palace. Tanks crossed the gates of the place that had once been the highest center of power of the Republic of Vietnam. Inside the palace, President Dinh Văn Minh and the remaining cabinet no longer had the ability to direct a war that had reached its end. After that, Dinh Văn Minh and Vu Van Mo were taken to Saigon radio to record the declaration of surrender. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, that declaration was broadcast over the radio waves. There was no longer any defensive line strong enough to reverse the situation. There was no longer any international promise that could turn into rescue in time. There was no longer any political solution broad enough to preserve the South as it had once existed. At 11:30, the flag of the victorious side flew over the roof of Independence Palace. For many people, that was the moment of liberation, the end of the war, the moment when the country opened the road toward reunification after too many years of division. For the soldiers from the North and the revolutionary forces of the South, that image carried joy, tears, the memory of comrades who had fallen, and the feeling that a long journey had finally reached its destination. One cannot understand that day without understanding the genuine faith of those who had passed through forests and mountains, bombs and bullets, hunger, cold, and loss in order to see their flag raised in the middle of Saigon. But in that same moment, on the other side of memory, There were people who felt that their entire life had just been erased. For them, the new flag did not merely replace a political symbol. It signaled the end of an army they had once served, a republic they had once believed in, a city they had once called their capital, a future in which they had imagined their children would grow up. Some felt relief because the war had stopped. Some stood stunned because they knew that from then on they belonged to the defeated side. Some had not yet had time to cry because before them still lay papers, uniforms, personal records, family, and tomorrow. For that reason, April 30th does not have only one meaning. It has many layers of memory stacked upon one another. In Vietnam's official historiography, it is the day of the liberation of the South and national reunification. In the memory of many people from the Republic of Vietnam and of the Vietnamese diaspora, it is the day of losing the country, the day of disintegration, the beginning of separation. Those two names do not easily stand beside each other. But history, if it wishes to be honest, must be wide enough to see both the joy of the victorious and the wound of the defeated. A flag rising can end a war on the map, but it does not immediately heal families who have lost loved ones, soldiers whose lives changed in a single morning, or children who did not understand why their parents had to whisper when speaking about the past. Saigon on that day did not only change hands. Saigon changed memory. And when the gunfire died down, the greatest question no longer lay at the gates of Independence Palace, but in the lives of the people who would have to pay the price for the page of history that had just turned. After April 30th, 1975, the war had officially ended. But for many Vietnamese families, another life had just begun, quieter, longer, and harder to name. Some entered re-education camps, some were sent to new economic zones. Some searched for a way to flee by sea in the night, entrusting their lives to a small boat in the middle of the ocean. Some stayed behind and learned to speak softly about the past, hiding uniforms, papers, and photographs in the most secluded corners of the house. Peace had arrived, but not everyone was able to touch peace in the same way. For the victorious, it was the day the country became one continuous land after many decades of division and war. For the defeated, it was the day they lost their place in history. For the Americans, Saigon became the symbol of a war that had moved beyond the control of a great power. And for ordinary people, history did not appear in maps or speeches. It appeared in a meal missing a father, in a letter sent from a distant camp, in a child growing up in a new country while still hearing his parents speak of the homeland with a choked voice. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people left their homeland by sea or through migration programs. Some reached the shores of freedom, some remained offshore forever, without graves, without names in the great books of history. That is the part of the price that no side can contain within a single word such as victory or defeat. For war does not only take lives, it also takes away home, youth, faith, and sometimes even the right to tell one's own pain. Saigon in 1975, therefore, does not only answer the question of who won and who lost. It forces us to ask a harder question. In the end, in every war, who must go on living with the part of history that others decided for them? Some wars end with a document. Some wars end with a flag. Some wars end when a tank passes through the gate of a presidential palace. But for human beings, war often does not end on the exact day history records in books. It remains in the eyes of a mother, seeing her son off to a re-education camp without knowing when she will meet him again. It remains in the small suitcase of a family leaving home in the middle of the night. It remains on fragile boats out on the vast sea, where some people reach a new shore, while others lie forever among nameless waves. It remains in the voices of Vietnamese people far from home, when they tell their children and grandchildren about a city that once truly existed, a flag that once truly existed, a way of life that once truly existed, and then one day suddenly became memory. Saigon in 1975 is not only the story of Vietnam. It is the story of every people that has passed through war, division, and exile. Because anywhere in the world, when a map changes color, there are always families whose lives must change. When a government collapses, there are always ordinary people who must learn to live under a new name. And when history declares that the war has ended, perhaps somewhere, in a very small house, someone is still quietly opening an old box, looking again at a photograph, a uniform, a letter, and understanding that the past has never truly gone away. Therefore, Saigon's final question is not only who won, nor is it only who lost. The remaining question, deeper and harder to answer, is this. After every war, who is the one who pays the longest price? Perhaps it is not those who sign the orders, not those who draw the maps, not those who read speeches of victory or defeat. It is the families who must go on living, those who must remain silent in order to survive, those who must leave in order to be free, those who stay behind in order to endure. And the generations born after the war, still carrying within themselves a sorrow they did not create. That is why we tell this story. Not to reopen hatred, not to trap history inside a single verdict, but to remember that behind every victory there are tears, behind every defeat there are human beings, and behind every historic day there are small lives forced to carry the heaviest burden of their age. Saigon has changed its name. The war has receded into the distance. But that question still remains. If one day your homeland becomes memory, what will you carry with you to prove that you once belonged there?